This is your tech news briefing for Tuesday, April 18th. I'm Zoe Thomas for the Wall Street Journal. Last June, Apple accomplished something pretty big. For the first time, it accounted for more than half of the smartphone market in the US, according to Counterpoint Research. As of December, iPhones represented 52.5% of smartphones being used here, and one Counterpoint analyst said he expects that figure to keep creeping up. So how did Apple come to dominate the market? There are a few reasons, but one big one doesn't have anything to do with new iPhone models. With me to sort through this is WSJ tech columnist Christopher Mims. Hey Christopher, always great to have you with us.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Christopher, in your latest column, you wrote that Apple's dominance isn't just because it's viewed as cooler than some other brands. So what is it down to?
It's down to a lot of factors, and one, of course, is the dreaded green bubbles. And green bubbles are what outgoing text from an iPhone to an Android phone appear as. And when an Android phone is added to a group iMessage chat, it turns everybody's messages green and it makes videos tiny and unviewable. It's a lot of undesirable outcomes. So there's this network effect where there's a lot of peer pressure, especially among young people, for everyone to be on an iPhone. However, there's another big phenomenon going on, which is somewhat under the radar because it's less exciting, which is that the market for used and refurbished phones has absolutely exploded. And it's growing 14% per year. It represents, 1 in 8 phones purchased in the US already. And a lot of those devices are Apple devices because iPhones last a lot longer. Part of this is build quality, but a big part of it is just that Apple supports old phones with new operating system updates for much longer than any other handset maker, up to 6 years currently.
Is there an area where we've seen this in action, where we just see old iPhones being used more and more?
Definitely in the past, saw a lot of old iPhones being shipped to developing markets, but increasingly they're getting recirculated inside of wealthier countries. So they are being handed to young people. They're being handed to the budget conscious, the value conscious. In my own family, when it was time to give my newly christened teens devices, I just went on Back Market and found last generation iPhone SEs, which were less than $200. Part of this also is that phones just aren't changing as much generation to generation. So when I gave them those devices, they did everything that they needed them to do, and for a fraction of the price of a new phone.
Do rival companies like, say, Samsung do something similar?
Samsung has gotten wise to Apple's playbook in terms of making its phones last longer, and just this past month announced that they are going to support their Android phones for 4 years after their release, which is still, of course, less than the 6 years that Apple supports their devices. And that's only with their newest phones. Samsung also is exceptional. Most Android phone makers do not support their phones for that long.
What does this mean for Apple's sales, though? I mean, if everybody's just reusing their old phones or buying cheaper versions of reused phones, is that hitting Apple's bottom line at all?
So far, Apple has managed to grow its proportion of the premium phone market, which is anything above $600, fast enough to make it so that these older devices aren't impacting its sales. So it just keeps grabbing more and more of the expensive phone market. So Apple is winning at both ends of this spectrum, selling more premium devices than ever and capturing more of the low end through used devices than ever.
Does it help Apple at all to have sort of these low-end reused devices on the market, apart from people being seen using them, apart from maybe it makes people think they're cooler? Does Apple as a company get anything from it?
Apple's done this amazing job of creating this totally new stream of revenue, which they can extract from any iPhone, whether it's used or new. And they call this their services revenue. So that's the percentage take that they get on every app that's sold through their app store. It's also things like Apple TV Plus, Apple Music, iCloud. This now represents about 20% of Apple's revenue and an even larger portion of Apple's profits, because services are software, so they're highly profitable.
Christopher, the thing is, at the end of the day, Apple is a smartphone maker. It does want to sell new versions of its phones, and we've seen across the market that premium models are doing better. So might it lean on the premium higher-end models to attract new customers if it has this robust resale market already?
I think absolutely. I mean, the funny thing is that these trade-in programs, I think, help people buy more expensive iPhones, right? Because they're not just paying full freight, even if they're going with a carrier, right? They're getting to sometimes $300-$400 on these trade-ins. And every year, Apple's what's called average selling price just keeps going up because they just keep adding more, honorifics to their phone. So first we had the Pro, now it's the 14 Pro Max. I wouldn't be surprised if there was like a 14 Pro Max and God knows what they'll add to it, Plus or something. And they'll just make there'll be an extra camera bump or some screen thing or whatever, because people have this incredible appetite for the highest end devices.
And we've been talking mostly about the US market. Is this the case globally for Apple?
It's been really interesting to see that Apple has made this playbook work in a lot of other countries. In South Korea, for example, the home of Samsung, a majority of consumers under age 29 actually have Apple devices, which I find incredible. You're seeing this play out in Japan, somewhat in Europe, maybe less so, but in all of these places where people have enough money, they're opting for the premium devices, they're buying the used devices, and Apple's share of the installed base just keeps creeping up.
All right, that's our tech columnist, Christopher Mims. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Zoe.
And that's it for today's Tech News Briefing. For more tech stories, head over to our website, WSJ.com. I'm Zoe Thomas for the Wall Street Journal. Thanks for listening.